Is there such a thing as too much luck? Is there such a thing as too much fun? Messing around, wondering how it's taken so long. I'm really so strong. It's not too much at all.
Welcome to Too Much. We are in the early nascent stages of 2026. For those of you that follow Chinese astrology, we are still sitting in the final weeks of the year of the snake, some final shedding before we enter the year of the fire horse, which feels promising because it's about movement and momentum. And hopefully, I'm going to hold faith that that movement and momentum is for the positive. And today we have a very special guest, someone I'm very excited to have on the podcast and to share with you all, Dr. Tasha Golden. And she is a singer songwriter turned behavioral scientist. So we know how much I love the mergings of both sides of the brain. And she's a leading expert creativity driven growth and innovation. She speaks and consults globally on creativity, leadership, well being, and change. Dr. Golden was the first director of research for the International Arts and Minds Lab at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She is also adjunct faculty for the University of Florida's Center for Arts and Medicine and lead author of Arts on Prescription, a field guide for U.S. communities. Named one of 2024's Fierce 50 by Fierce Pharma for her innovative work integrating arts and healthcare, Dr. Golden has published extensively on the intersections of creativity, behavior, and well being. She now helps clients and audiences apply the science to advance innovation, connection, and growth. Her work is shaped by her early experience as a career artist and entrepreneur. As a singer-songwriter for the critically acclaimed band Ellery, she toured internationally with songs in TV and film. But when severe burnout and depression ended her music career, she began raising questions about mental health, creativity, and well being that led to her PhD, ongoing research, and global work as a speaker and consultant. She is a published poet as well, founder of Project Uncaged, a trauma informed creative writing program for incarcerated girls, and developer of How We Human, a training in mental health and trauma informed practice designed for creatives. She has spoken at venues such as South by Southwest, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Politico, and CogX, with upcoming talks at Google and the Mayo Clinic. And leveraging her research and background, Golden helps clients and audiences raise their own new questions, linking science and creative practice to grow their work.
Oh,
What an
thank you
honor to
so
have
much
you
for
here.
having me, Denise. Glad to be here.
So, I am always very curious as people whose careers evolve. You started as a musician. I started as an entrepreneur before really reclaiming my creative truth. And I always look back on my time, building a creative tech company as sort of adjacent to my purpose. Like it checked a lot of the boxes seemingly, but it did lead to a lot of burnout. And there were things about it that when I look back, I'm like, those were not really in alignment with my core truth. And I wonder how you look back at your time as a musician.
Wanted to be a singer-songwriter from the time I was a really little girl. I just wanted to write songs and travel the world and play them for people. And I worked hard to be able to do that, that all through school. Just like that was just my aim, just laser focus. And I was so glad that I got to do that for a lot of years and just work with really amazing musicians and songs and TV and film and things that felt like, yeah, this is what we were aiming for this whole time. And unfortunately, and this is true for so many artists, I know that anybody who's listening who is currently a full-time artist or has made a go of it or things like that, there's not a lot of support for artists. Just being like the unpredictability of the industry, the isolation sometimes, especially if you're touring a lot, then you're not with your community, you're out on the road by yourself a lot, and that can just take its toll. And I think it's been interesting for me, after this happened for me to see the research that, like, over 70% of people in the music industry report having anxiety or depression or some kind of mental illness, and that's far above the national average. And of course, it's not because music makes people ill, it's the music business, it's the structure that is there or not there for
Yeah.
people. And I didn't realize, for me, I wanted to be in this business so badly, and I wanted to be a singer songwriter so much that I felt like I was happy sacrifice all of these other things. I was happy to sacrifice comfort, happy to sacrifice almost anything. And I ultimately did.
Yeah.
The burnout that I went into, like once I couldn't tour anymore, I didn't know if I wanted to be here at all. Like um that was the level of
Right.
the kind of quote unquote commitment to the art
Right.
that not sustainable.
I think that's so true, is that if we were liberated by the systems that contain the arts, you would find a lot more people would choose art. But in the capitalist culture we live in, it is so hard to figure out. We just did an episode about this, how to be
Mm,
working creative in a capitalist world, and how to not to burn out, how not to go broke, and how to figure out how to walk that tightrope, because that's essentially what it is. Like, you're trying to move between these two worlds. There's a 3D reality of this system that we live in, and yet our heart is calling
yeah.
for something
And
different.
if there was, if there were other options, I was just talking about this earlier today, that when I was young, I saw the binary choice was either I'm a full-time music artist or I kind of can't do music at all, because in our system,
Mhm.
as it is, your job is sort of your identity. And so if you choose a different job, then you're no longer a musician. That was sort of how I felt when I was 18. I don't have that belief now, but I knew that if I had a different job, you'd be working that 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week. Now there's a lot of people who can't pay their rent unless they're working three
Yeah.
different, hustles. And so when are you going to make music,
Yep.
right? And if we had a system where people could be like making a living wage, having like a job where you worked reasonable hours, then I think we would in that scenario also have many more people choosing to make art and making really great art, because they didn't have to choose between either I do this all of the time or I kind of can't do it at all, which isn't always the actual
Yeah.
choice in front of us anyway, but our system certainly makes that seem like the choice, and sometimes does make that the choice for many of us.
We definitely devalue this idea, if you're not all in on your dreams, which is such a
Mm,
privileged concept because most of us don't have the luxury of being all in on something like that without some sort of financial benefactor. And that's what I'm trying to debunk, is never apologize for working some weird jobs
yeah.
to fund your creative life. Like, that doesn't mean you're not serious. You are doing what you have to do to follow the call. And the industry very much preys upon, like all sort of entertainment industries prey upon this idea that you are willing to sacrifice your well-being for this opportunity. Like, you're the
Hmm.
chosen one. You've been picked. So abandon all needs, because if it's not you, you're disposable. And I think we're really moving into this different paradigm where people are calling that bluff and saying, like, no, I'm not doing that. And we see that with Lola Young,
Mm,
just canceled her tour to prioritize her mental health. And what a great example to set, to say, I understand I'm going to be a better
yeah.
artist
Yeah.
if
And
I take
stay
care of
around to be
myself.
able to make the art, to be here. Yeah.
Exactly. So can you tell me about the pivot then? I've been there, where you're like, if it's not this, like, what is the point? Like, I'm here to do this thing, and if I can't do this, then what am I doing? How did you find your way into the work that you do now? And how did you know it was pulling at the same heartstring?
That was a messy and long road.
Again.
When we first stopped touring, I was in bed for a lot of weeks. So if you can't get out of bed, you certainly can't play a show. I didn't know when I was going to play a show again. I felt like I kind of knew that I wasn't going to tour anymore. And the saving grace, I think, at that time was that somehow I had this sense or this impression that the story that I am a singer songwriter and that being in the music industry is my path to fulfillment, I had the impression that that is a story. And it was the one story that I had.
Mm,
I think a difficulty was like realizing that for all of the creativity that I had had as an artist, I hadn't been able to be creative about my own life. I had one story that I knew how to tell about who I was and how I fit into the world and why I was here on the planet. And so during that time, it was sort of like, well, what's the next story then? Or what's the story going to be? And that can maybe sound a little bit hopeful. This did not feel hopeful. This did not feel like an inspiring, aspirational kind of thing. I was really grieving and I was really ragey about it. I hated it. But I did feel like, well, this was one story. And that means that there's got to be a different one. And I don't have any idea what it's going to be. Um, and I did during that time become interested in what I had noticed in my work, which is that I had songs about difficult experiences, like my family's history of domestic violence, my own history of depression. And what I had seen is that anywhere we went around the world, those were always the songs that people stayed after concerts wanting to talk to me about. And they would share their own histories with similar kinds of experiences. And many of them would say that I'm the first person they'd ever told. And I certainly had that experience for myself, that there were things that I had shared from a stage in a song that I had literally never said out loud to another human being. So I was telling it, I can share something with a few hundred people in a music venue that I hadn't told a friend before. And, I got kind of curious about, why is that? Why do we feel that we can share things in the context of the arts that we don't share otherwise? And I didn't know where that question was taking me. There was a long road where I wound up doing a master's degree in creative writing. I thought, oh, this will hone my songwriting craft. Maybe I'll do more of that. But then I got really interested in research, and I still was just so interested in what I was calling social heresies. How do the arts help us say things that we feel like we're not supposed to be able to say, but in those contexts and containers, we can tell the truth to ourselves and to other people about who we are and what we're experiencing. We can bear witness to things that otherwise we can't sit with. And I was so fascinated about what was going on there and how it was happening. And I founded a creative writing program called Project Uncaged for incarcerated girls, and saw the same things with them, that they would share things in their poems and songs that they were not talking about otherwise, that they had never talked to anybody about otherwise. And a lot of those things that they were sharing were crucial to our ability as a community to take care of these young women, to help make sure that they could be successful in their lives and in their communities. And so, yeah, I kind of pulled it on the threads of this question of, like, why and how do the arts help us to communicate and connect and to know ourselves? How do they change what we think and how we know the world around us? And wound up, pursuing that question into a PhD in public health, specializing in how the arts affect our health and well-being.
I'm obsessed with so many things you just said, but I really just want to come back to this idea of we have multiple stories, and it can be such a limiting belief to lock ourselves into one. And like you, I like when my startup shut down, it was professional heartbreak in the same way that you experienced, immense grief, because I had thought that was like going to be my life. And it took, and the gift of that heartbreak, which I'm sure you can agree is sort of like you unlock when you sort of lose the dream, you're liberated in some ways, because then you start to ask different questions and deeper questions, which is like, okay, if I just lost the thing that I thought I wanted, what do I really want? And what's going to make me happy? And how can I design a life that's meaningful to me?
Yeah, and it's a hard thing to talk about sometimes, because it can sound a little bit like you're trying to put a silver lining on something that was awful, or that it's almost like almost like we're not taking
No.
it seriously.
Yeah.
Or yeah, it can kind of sound like, oh, it's okay that terrible thing happened because it opened up these new doors. But it's more like, and I think this, yeah, your experience reflects this as well, that as humans, we are going to encounter things that we can't control, and it's a matter of recognizing that what feels like a wall when you hit it is often not the wall of reality. It's the wall of the story that you've had about reality. It's mistaking the map for the territory, right? And there's research around this, that if any listeners are interested, like the idea of post-traumatic growth, and this can come after all kinds of different types of trauma, including the loss of a loved one, but incredibly serious and difficult and tragic things that happen to people. And then on the other side of that, there's a certain kind of growth that could not have happened if their entire world hadn't been shaken. And this is different from what we call resilience in the literature, which is a kind of ability to bounce back. It's kind of when you cannot bounce back and something paradigmatic like shifts for you, something really fundamental shifts for you, there's a different kind of growth that happens there.
Yeah.
And none of these folks that have been
Yes.
part of research studies around post-traumatic growth would be like, I'm so glad that thing happened to me so that I could have this new realization. Any of those people would
Right.
say, like, they would have their loved one back in a heartbeat if it, they would trade all of that growth
Of course.
for that loved one, right? So it's not silver lining, it's not toxic positivity. It's more like recognizing the truth of the human experience, which is that it's vast and we have all kinds of different ways of encountering it, and then different directions that we can take once we do.
You just said it so beautifully, but you are irrevocably changed. There's a different person that was born out of that experience. And I did a talk about my professional heartbreak. And I think resilience is I don't like the definition we have for it, largely because I don't think it's about bouncing back. You rise, you grow, you shift. But this idea of bouncing back means that, like, if you're resilient, you are moving quickly. And I resent that concept because I probably stewed in my grief for like
Sure.
3 years before I sort of started to figure out what was next or who I was gonna be, and, there was, like, tiny, maybe, like, breadcrumbs along the way of putting me on a new path, but it wasn't a fast process, and I'm someone who, prior to
Mm.
that, valued speed, was totally bought into the capitalist paradigm, and so it was like everything broke, and it took a really long time to come back. And that doesn't mean that we are less resilient. And that's sort of my issue with that word, is that I actually think I'm incredibly resilient, wildly resilient. But I think the processing is actually what makes
I
you
love that care with
resilient.
the language, yeah, and kind of the ways that there could be implications to these terms that we don't surface, but we feel them, or our nervous system can feel it. And like your sense of the speed of that, like bouncing, does have an implication of speed. That's so interesting and important to kind of take up and emphasize. And yeah, I love, maybe we just need more words. Like, okay, maybe if resilience is bouncing back, then what is this? Is it tenacity? Is it a commitment to growth? Is it a commitment to
Yeah.
figuring out who I can be and how I can be in the life that I have here? And what might we call that? Maybe we can call it resilience. Yeah, I so appreciate any
Right.
conversation around the language that we use for things that especially when we're talking about things that are incredibly difficult and that necessarily by definition indicate a lot of human excavation and deep work. And
The more I write, the more I find I'm very limited by the English language, which is a new experience for me as a talker. And I found that the emotional vocabulary we have is so not enough. Like, we need so many more words to talk about the emotional landscape of what it is to be human. We had a guest on our last episode of 2025. She talked about muscular
yes.
hope, which is different than hope because it felt more grounded. And so, how can we expand the terms to make people feel more seen in the language? I struggle with someone who's very good with words and language, and I'm like, this just doesn't feel like enough.
Absolutely. This was a big, I mean, we could nerd out about this all day. It was a big part of my dissertation research, was looking at what can we know when we do health research, especially about difficult topics. My dissertation was around perceptions and experiences of violence. So especially when we're talking about difficult topics, what can we learn if people have the opportunity to express their experience via the arts versus what we learn when they express their experience on, conventional surveys, for example. And some of the things that we saw in that research are exactly what you're
Mm,
talking about, that when an experience was named for people, and that's what happens in a survey, basically, right? You're asked a question, did this happen or not? But this is something that's kind of predefined and named for you, and you have to determine whether you align with that or not, right? When people had more choice as to how they described their
yeah.
experience or their concerns or etc., in the creative writing data that we had, just so many more things came up, and we got so much more nuanced data and so many more examples of people's experiences and their growth, their post-traumatic growth, their resilience, their perseverance, their, including their, this is definitely not anything that came up in the surveys, but people's sense of their own power, that I survived this, that was so clear in some of the
Mm,
creative writing, not all of it, but wasn't able to emerge at all in the surveys. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of people need to feel like they have the capacity, but also the freedom to name their experience and to find ways to do that that aren't, necessarily, that may not be understood by other people, but maybe they have the chance to be seen and understood in the ways that they want to, but also to name things for themselves and determine what they mean by it themselves.
especially right now, it's such a hard time to be alive. And I'm very rarely at a loss for language or words. And I have found myself many times in the past year, like, I just don't have the words for the depth of sadness that I feel collectively, globally, for the world right now. And I want us to be able to articulate what that pit of sort of futility, I guess, is sort of how I feel, as we work towards what we believe is a better, more humane world. Sometimes we just like sort of question, if we're making a
Yeah,
dent.
fair. And I think sometimes this is where my interest in the role of like arts and culture in health, but also in change comes into play, because it's sort of like, how do we, like I mentioned earlier, how do we expand our capacity to bear witness to our lives and to our world?
Mhm.
How do we expand our capacity to connect and communicate about those things? Where do we find those containers for those experiences? And we see these emerging in various types of rituals, whether that's individual rituals, but mainly collective rituals, and those can be faith-based and kind of spiritual in nature, but oftentimes they're not. They can be political in nature, people showing up on streets or in mutual aid scenarios, or showing up for each other and giving voice to things that somebody else can't give voice to, right? These are ways that we find to make sense of ourselves and our world when it when push comes to shove, right? I often say
Yeah.
we evolved to make and share art for a reason. If we didn't need it for our survival, we would have stopped doing this thousands of years ago. And one of the reasons
Mhm.
that we need it is because it expands our capacity for communication. And so
Yeah.
I'm often encouraging people to
Yeah.
you know, tap into it when you need to, that there's nothing wrong with you if you find yourself less and less able to share your experience in a conversational way, like you and I are doing right now. If you feel like you can't do that, that doesn't mean something's wrong with you or you're deficient. It means that, you've hit a moment where your human experience is larger than the language we have to attach to it. So, okay, that's when we tap into some of these other essentially technologies that humans have developed of how to handle
Yeah.
the human experience, which is always unruly and vast. Even when it's on the good side, can be very unruly.
The merging of science and creativity for me, even though it seems, quite obvious that we would figure out how these two things can work better together. A lot of it feels actually quite new. Like you're pioneering a different definition of fulfillment, a different way of modeling, I guess, well-being in the world, because it's something that historically has been more separate. And so, can you help us really understand why a creative practice is so important for
I
humanity?
would maybe start by a thought experiment for listeners might be to define well-being for yourself. And when I'm talking about well-being, or really when I'm talking about almost anything around the world, I always ask audiences, assuming that it's more than just the absence of suffering, assuming it's more than just absence of suffering, what is well-being? What the heck is that? We use the word a lot. What is it? I would love your listeners to take just the briefest moment to answer that for yourself. What do you think it might be? And like I said, I get to ask this all over the world, and the answers that I get are incredibly diverse. They're often really fascinating. They do cohere around some themes, like having a sense of meaning and purpose, having a sense of belonging or being part of something greater than yourself, having a sense of agency and influence over things that matter to you, being able to experience beauty, being able to be creative, having a sense of support when you're suffering. And those kinds of definitions, that very last one that I said, are some of the most interesting to me, because they not only, it's not just that well-being isn't merely the absence of suffering, but that definition of well-being, that I have support when I am suffering, includes, it takes suffering for granted. So that implies that you can be well while
Mhm.
suffering if you have a sense of support, of meaning and purpose, of these
Mhm.
different kinds of things. That's really interesting and represented in many cultures throughout history far better than the Western dominant
Mhm.
white norms that we have in a lot of society right now that are dominant.
What's the duality that we had mentioned before we recorded, which I've been in some of the most peak moments of romantic heartbreak and still been able to just be in awe
Mm.
at the beauty of the world. I was in Italy one summer post heartbreak. I had to DJ like 6 weddings in the span of
Oh, wow.
6 weeks after this heartbreak, and it was really hard. And I remember I was like in this restaurant by myself reading a book, getting ready to interview this person for the podcast. So I'm like prepping, and there's like this piano playing, and this waiter comes over, and I just start crying, right? I'm just like bawling in this restaurant. And he's like, "Are you okay? Are you okay, miss?" And I'm like, "The piano is just so
Hmm.
beautiful. Like it's just so beautiful." And he's like, "Okay." But in my head, it was like this real moment of seeing such immense beauty, being this historic, beautiful country while also carrying this deep heartbreak. And I was suffering, but at the same time, I was able to hold this deep understanding of like, this is temporary, I guess. This belief that I know that this is a temporary feeling and I can still appreciate the beauty around me despite me feeling
Yeah.
extremely hollow.
Yeah, and again, it's so important to help people recognize that that isn't to diminish the suffering or to say like the suffering doesn't matter, it's okay, we don't need to do anything about it because people can find a way to be well in the midst of suffering. So let's just let all of our difficulties and systemic injustices continue because we can figure out how to be well. It's not that at all, but it's almost like honoring and recognizing the amazing,
Right.
again, vastness of the human experience, that this is something that humans do and can do and that we want to do. That, I was listening to somebody recently who was saying like, when I lose somebody that I love, I want to be sad. When I try something and fail at it, I don't want to
Mhm.
just be peppy and be like, oh, no problem. Like, I want to sit with that disappointment for a little bit. I want to be able to, I don't want
Of
my human
course.
experience to just be this one note happiness, even if I could choose that, and none of us get to. But
Mm.
they were just, kind of honoring these experiences that we
Mhm.
have. And yeah, so the reason that I start with that definition of well-being with people is that it does shift what we think health is and how we think we get it. And if well-being um, is about far more than just, are you not sick, are you not in pain, are you not injured, then we have to design our lives, but more, even maybe more essentially, our collective decisions and our systems and our structures differently to make sure that we can provide not only for people to not be sick and not in pain, which by the way, we need to get better at that anyway, but we also need to
Yeah.
provide for people to have a way to live a life that has meaning and purpose and a sense of belonging. And there are many ways that we can do that collectively for each other, but it's not something that any individual can can just make happen on their own.
Mm. And so how does a creative practice
Ah, thank
help
you.
us
You've
with
brought me
that?
back to okay, so creativity. I think that that's when you start to see that well-being is things like meaning, purpose, belonging, connection, beauty, etc. You start to realize that these things are not things that are traditionally taken care of by our healthcare systems. These are things that fall under the umbrella of arts and culture. When human beings are seeking meaning and purpose and these things like that throughout history, they are not going into a clinic and talking to a physician to get those things typically. They are going to art, they're going to nature, they're going to spiritual practices, they're going to collective endeavors and initiatives, and they're taking on quests and things like that, right? These require us to, number one, recognize the important value of arts and culture and creativity in our lives. And then two, it reminds us how creative we have to be about how we do health and what we think health is, how we think it's created, who we think is involved in the process of creating it. All of those things require us to get a lot more imaginative, because the limited ways that we have thought about it, which is that health is just the absence of disease, basically. And I will say that the World Health Organization back in the
Yeah.
1940s defined health. They said health is complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And they really did say complete, like that adjective is in there. Complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So they are saying like it is
Mm.
not just absence of disease, it is also the presence of well-being. And if we actually took that definition seriously, we would have to get pretty imaginative about how we do health and recognize that it's not something that can be confined to one sector like the healthcare sector. This is something that we are all creating together across sectors and industries.
Is that still the definition?
That was from 1946 and going strong.
Okay. Okay, great. Just wanted to
Yeah.
check. You talk about being imaginative, and what is the role, how do you see the role of imagination in humanity? Why is imagination so important for us?
Maybe it's easiest to go back to the story that I mentioned about, post burnout and in the midst of major depression and trying to imagine a different story for my life. Sometimes when I talk with people about the importance of creativity and imagination in our lives and in our world and in our systems and structures. I think some people interpret me as an optimist, like I'm really hopeful and I'm sitting around aspirational and inspirational, like, hey, let's just go imagine another world. And yeah, I have treatment-resistant depression. I've lived with chronic burnout. I am not at all an optimist. Um, but that's why I talk about imagining otherwise, is because I have to. I feel like I don't have a choice. If I want to survive here, I have to be able to imagine that the future can be different than the current state of things, that I can feel different in the future, like you were mentioning about your time in Italy, that I can. So it's the reminder that things can be temporary, but also that the world could change, the world could be better, the things that make me feel despair are things that could change. If not in my lifetime, maybe I can contribute to it, right? And so, yeah, I always want to start by saying, like, this isn't some kind of like, this isn't something for people who are feeling hopeful and excited. Although if you are, then it's also for you. But it's not relegated to
Yeah.
people who are just feeling like uh, a sense of enthusiasm and optimism. It's for any of us who refuse to accept that the way things are the way things have to stay. And James Baldwin has always been a North Star for me, and he said, the world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. And that is the call. That is the highest call I can think of to any of us, that we need not take or leave the world as it was when we came in. And that doesn't mean that we can just wave a wand and make it better. He certainly didn't believe that. But it was like, it's not so much that an optimist might be somebody who thinks that change is likely or probable, positive change. And for me, it's like, I don't think that we can make a better future because I see that as being inevitable or probable. I think that we can because we can, like, just objectively, scientifically, change is inevitable. Everything is going to change. We do have some influence on the direction that it takes. And so we might as well decide that, okay, if we refuse to accept that how it is okay, if we're like, this is not acceptable, all right, what are we going to imagine instead? And how do we take some actions to make that a reality?
100%. I deeply resonate with that. I just believe so intensely that we are the architects of our own realities. I really do believe that we are driving the cars of our own life. And so if we are driving the cars of our own life, we can certainly steer each other together to create a different world. That's very much my sort of sentiment for 2026, is that we get to decide the world we want to live in, and we get to show up to it accordingly. And so what's happening, we don't have to accept it, and we don't have to agree with the direction of what's happening. We can do our part every day to say, I'm imagining a different world, and I'm going to breathe life into that every
Yeah.
single
And I
day.
think sometimes the way that we talk as a society about imagination, it seems like something that's relegated to childhood, or it's something that's escapism. And so a lot of times people can mistake, like, oh, if you're imagining a different future, you're not grounded in the reality of what's happening, or you're trying to escape the brutality of what's happening in the world by just imagining this, utopian future or something like that. And for me,
Yeah.
and this is what I see in my research and in the science, but I would describe it as imagination and all creativity is rooted in refusal. Like that you at its most
Mhm.
basic, like, to write a song is to refuse to believe that all of the songs have already been written and that you can't inject another song into the universe, right? To paint a picture is to refuse to believe that that canvas can't change. And then moving beyond art, like any change or any creativity that we would inject into the world requires us to refuse the world as it is, to refuse to keep it the way that it is, right? And so all creativity is rooted in refusal. And scientifically, these emotions that we feel around grief, rage, terror, despair, all of these, we evolved to have these emotions, and they tell us something about what we value. They tell us something about what we refuse. And so it's not imagination as an escape
Yeah.
from the difficulty of our lives or the world. It's imagination rooted in the difficulties of our world and in the refusal to accept that those things are fine as they are, or in the
Mhm.
refusal to believe that we have no power to change anything. Even if we don't individually, we could collectively. Even if we can't change it tomorrow, we maybe can contribute to the change that future generations can experience. And I'm always saying, like, who benefits if you don't believe that we can imagine and enact a better future? Like, who does that serve? Because it's not that serves the status quo. It's the people who imagine that wind up making change. That's been true forever.
Yeah, because if we don't imagine what's next, then what's next, right? You just look at sci-fi or anything in that realm. You read all these stories, and all of a sudden, 20 years later, they're happening in the real world. And there's things that felt so far away at the time. And because someone put it into consciousness, I tend to believe that's also why things proliferate, because you're like, oh, the idea was put out into the world and now
Yeah.
it can be made
And
3D.
we can take so much from that. There are just so many examples, like some of the great thinkers and doers and change makers of history, the people that we look to as just embodiments of some of the highest human ideals, are people who had to see themselves and the world in a different way than everyone around them. That's where everything begins.
Mhm. So you wrote an article about change making, and you have a great analogy about the river, and I would love you to share it with us before we dig
Oh,
into the next piece.
yes, in public health, we often use an analogy of a river to say that sometimes people are experiencing an acute crisis or an acute condition, and so they might need to go to a hospital or go to a physician, right? And you might imagine that those doctors and physicians and nurses, clinicians of various types, pulling people out of a river, right? They have fallen in, they are already suffering, they are concerned already, and you're pulling them out, and that's such important work. And in public health, we talk about how at some point somebody's going to need to go upstream and find out, why are all these people falling in the river at all? Is the bridge broken? Like, is somebody up there pushing people in? Like, what is going on? Because if we can fix whatever's happening upstream, then some people might still fall in, but it's going to be far fewer. And people are going to have better lives where they're not, panicked and drowning in a river, right? And so, from that metaphor, I'm often talking, whether it's with people in health and healthcare and public health, or people in the arts, or people in, you know, Fortune 10 companies, whatever it might be. How can we use this metaphor to understand our lives and our work in a different way? So, not just what's going on right in front of me, but why does that problem exist in the first place? Like, can I go upstream and figure out why this is the way that it is at all? And sometimes for people who are in service industries, it's sort of like a way to imagine, okay, there's a certain problem that you solve, but is that problem inevitable to the human experience, or is that problem the result of a lot of other things? And if we can get upstream of that, how might that shift your business or your nonprofit or your initiative, your cause, to know what's upstream of it? What else might you be working on, or how might that give you new ideas for how to approach the work as it is? And of course, at the individual level, for us to have a little bit more awareness of whatever we might be struggling with, what are some of the root causes of that, some of the upstream causes of that, and how might knowing about those give us a better, sometimes more compassionate, just more informed lens on our own experience? And how might that give us some ideas about how we can be part of changing that, not just for ourselves, but for our communities and the larger world?
And to understand more deeply, you wrote about learned helplessness, or this idea that sometimes we feel like we were just falling in the river and we can't affect real change, and so we feel a little bit like we're treading water falling in the river, versus really understanding we're part of this larger organism in which if we can see upstream, we can see that maybe we're falling in the river because of something else.
Yeah, this problem exists, and that is just the way that it is, and that therefore that is just the way that it has to be, and there's nothing that you or I could do to make a difference in that. And I sympathize with that so much, because if you are, pulling yourself out of the getting yourself out of the river, pulling other people out of the river, you can feel like, oh, there is my life, I'm over capacity already, just trying to survive, just trying to make sure that this person next to me can survive, my community can survive. I don't have time or capacity to metaphorically go upstream and figure out what's going on. And also, it can seem so powerful and inevitable, like whatever is going on in our systems and structures can just be like, there's no way that I can effect change there. And so we just kind of hunker down. But then again, that's usually a limitation of the story we're telling, and not a limitation of actual reality. There is a difference between not knowing how to effect change at that upstream level and that being impossible. Like, just because you do not personally know how to do it, and maybe none of your friends does either, doesn't mean that therefore nothing can be done. That's just an opportunity for, like, okay, well, what if I chose to believe that something can be done and I just don't know what it is yet? How does that change my approach to this, or how I think
Right.
about it?
And so, say that's the case. Say I'm in the river, I'm stuck at the end of the river, not looking upstream, and we live in a system. Like if we take a step back, right? Like the system is the upstream, and sometimes we feel like doesn't matter like how much we do, we're still stuck falling in the river. And so, in a system that is designed that way to keep a lot of people in the river, how do we effectively participate when it's designed to keep us dysregulated, dependent, and stuck?
It is not an individual affair, right? I was just talking yesterday with some folks saying like, oh, this group of people that we were just working with, they are so intense right now with new Medicaid cuts and things like that. They're just trying to make sure that their public hospitals stay open next week. They cannot be thinking about how we reimagine healthcare, right? And I was like, oh, that is fair. They should not
Right.
have to. That's not fair for them to have this task on their shoulders. But they can be locking arms with people who do have that capacity for whatever reason to be able to imagine a different kind of healthcare system and then to be able to pull all of these things together. So yeah, that's the first thing is that, we know intuitively, we know historically, and we know scientifically from the research that this is not something that we can do individually, that we must be in a situation where sometimes our capacity can be much depleted or even non-existent, but we are with people who still have some of their capacity, and at some point they're going to be depleted and we're going to have to be the ones who can take the oars, right? So it has to be a collective affair, and that doesn't mean that everybody has to be some, feel like you're some. I'm neurodivergent. I'll just say like I am neurodivergent, and I don't necessarily love big social situations. I don't want to be like holding hands with my entire community all the time. That's not my idea of well-being.
Yeah.
So it's not to say that this is some kind of like big social affair. It's more like in your general network or your sense of the world, like do you have a way that you are connected with other people, either really viscerally and directly, or even just mentally, in the sense that like that if you need to pass the baton in a sense, either literally by asking a friend to do something for you,
Hmm.
or kind of like figuratively by saying like, okay, I can't show up at that initiative that I really wanted to volunteer for, but I have to trust that if I take care of myself, I stay around to be able to show up another day, and somebody else is going to be there, right? We have to be a part of we have to recognize our need for a collective to make change. And then, yeah, the
Hmm.
recognizing, like you said, that the systems are
Yeah.
sort of designed to keep us dysregulated. That's what ensures that the status quo continues, and to see that like we don't make art and live our lives once we are no longer in a kind of like depleted and oppressed state. We make art and live our lives because that is where we are, and as a way to get out of it. And we see that from
Mhm.
such important thinkers throughout history. I think of folks like Audre Lorde, who said despair is a tool of our enemies, or of course Baldwin, who was always saying like, you know it, I'm not going to say that it's out of our hands. It's only out of our hands if we refuse to pick it up. That's what he said. So I think that we can look to some of these folks who were not, who I don't
Right.
think anyone would accuse either of them of being optimists. I'm not sure, but they were certainly really active in an environment that was designed to make sure that they almost to make sure that they couldn't be, and that's an important model for all of us.
Like it's really rooted optimism. That's what's really interesting to me is optimism that pairs with practicality, that really says, okay, this is how we live in a different world. It's not this idea. And that's a lot of why I do this podcast. I talk to thinkers like you because there's a lot of practical wisdom that exists that we have that people can employ in their day-to-day lives to feel more agency, to feel more power over their experience, to show up in the way that they want to show up. And that doesn't mean that you have to be working towards, activism or, collective change. I think that if we feel more agency over more sovereign in ourselves, we ultimately will end up changing the world anyways.
I think that that's really true in a lot of ways because I mean, sometimes I'm reminding, especially in like mental health trainings, we don't live in a world. It's not actually true that you have to, it feels like this, but it is not actually true that you have to choose between whether to be aware of what's going on in the world and involved in helping to change it and whatever that means for you, and having some peace and joy in your life. Like it can feel like you either have to completely zone out and be unaware and therefore be able to have peace, or you have to be involved and be like wrecked by the awareness of the world. And I'm often sharing, people, important folks have said for eons before me that, joy is a form of resistance, but it's also recognizing if helping people, whatever that, what are you helping them toward? If there is not actually a world in which it's possible to have peace and joy, then what are you I don't want to use like savioristic terms, but this is the easiest way to say it right now. Like, what are you saving people to if you're trying to save a certain population, but like ultimately the world that you believe exists is one where nobody ever gets to have peace or joy because ultimately somebody someplace is suffering, and as long as that's happening and we're aware of it, we don't get to have peace and joy ourselves. Yeah, I think that it's incredibly important to recognize that the space and the hard fought space that you make for joy and some kind of modicum of peace in your life is part of what would make you want to help other people have that at all. Like, it's sort of like the experience of something in your life that makes your life worth living is part of what drives that empathy of wanting other people to also have some of that safety, some of that peace, some of that connection, some of that beauty.
And so before we go here, what is your best prescription for finding congruence in a deeply misaligned landscape?
Oh, finding congruence. I can really only speak for myself, but I think that I find the most congruence in telling the truth about the misalignment. I don't know that there is for me a sense of congruence ever, but I think I feel the most when I have had moments where I felt something the most like that, it's when I feel like I'm in a space where people are telling the truth, or I'm in a space where I am able to tell and face the truth about my life or about the world or what's going on. And the dysregulation, the oppression, the brutality of the world, the confusion of it, the uncertainty of it, the losses in it. These aren't, I don't know that it would be adaptive to feel congruent when all of those things are going on, but it can feel, I think it's important to be able to tell the truth about them, and then to know that there is a way to face that truth without being annihilated by it. And I wouldn't know that for myself in my own experience, but I take that as important lessons from the people who have meant them the most to me as thinkers, whether it's, like I said, James Baldwin, or poets like Rilke, who said no feeling is final, but people who have been through, Viktor Frankl, people who have been through awful circumstances and found not align with it, but be human in it and tell the truth about it. That's what feels.
It's a really astute and true answer. It's so honest. So thank you for sharing that. This has been such a special hour for me and such a beautiful way to start the year with these themes in mind. Thank you so much for your time and for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the conversation and the rich questions, Denise. I appreciate it.
And will you let everyone know where they can find you?
Yeah, we'll make a special page for listeners. It's just tashagolden.com/too-much. And if you can find a couple free resources and ways to work with me.
Awesome. We will put everything in the show notes as well. And thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening. If you do like listening, it would mean the world to us if you could subscribe or review the podcast anywhere that you watch or listen to the podcast. It really helps with the algorithm to share this with the world. I want to give a special thank you to young Spielberg and Sarah Yarkin for their beautiful work on our opening jingle, Dana Boulos for her help with the beautiful art, and to all of you for tuning in and keeping this dream alive. If you want to hear certain topics or from certain guests, please feel free to email us. We really, really want to hear from you and see how we can best support you. See you next time.